In this module, it's time for fragments, portals, and refs. Okay, what's that? That will be more tools in our React toolbox that help us solve more problems. And in this module, we'll simply go through these different features and you will learn which problems they solve and why we need them and how you can use them, of course. We'll have a look at limitations we're actually facing with JSX code and how fragments can help us overcome those limitations. We'll learn how we can derive a cleaner DOM, a better code structure with the help of portals. And we'll work with refs and learn what refs actually are and why we need them. In React, we're working with JSX. We worked with JSX all the time here in this course already. In this course project, which we worked on in the last course module, which you find attached to this lecture, by the way, in case you didn't follow along, you can simply download it, extract it, run npm install and npm start, and you're good to go. In that project, we of course used JSX. JSX is that code you return in your components, which in the end will be rendered to the real DOM by React. That's what JSX is, and we use it all the time. But JSX has certain limitations. Specifically, there is one limitation which we also already faced in this course. If we have adjacent root level JSX elements, like in this example, we'll get an error. And with root level, I mean that we have two JSX elements next to each other, not wrapped by another JSX element, and we then return these side-by-side JSX elements, or we try to store them in variables. This will not work, because in React, in JSX in general, you can't have more than one root JSX element. So if you return a value, or if you store a value in a variable, or in a constant, or in a property, that value must only be exactly one JSX element, not 2 or 3 or 4 side-by-side adjacent elements. Now, that one element which you are allowed to have may of course have more children, which then also can be adjacent to each other. But that topmost element, which you're storing or returning, must only be one element. And the reason for that is actually not that difficult to understand, because this also isn't valid JavaScript. You can't return more than one thing in JavaScript either. You can return one number, not two. You can return one string, not two. Of course, you could return an array, and there you could have multiple numbers, but an array is already a new value. An array is just an object, so you still only return one array, one object, not two arrays at the same time. Right? So that is really important to understand here. Your JSX code translates into React create element, like you see it here at the bottom of the slide. And you must only have one React create element call which you return. Now, any nested JSX elements, so inside of that one root element, could be side by side, because in the React create element world, those children of that root element would be the third and fourth and fifth and so on argument. And that's something I had a closer look at in the basics module, where we explored how JSX translates into React create element calls. But because of that natural limitation of JavaScript, we must only have one root JSX element. Now, how can we work around that? There is one solution, and actually we can already use that solution here in that add user component in that provided project which you find attached. Here I do have a wrapping div, and that is a workaround. You can solve this problem by simply wrapping the adjacent elements with a div. If you do that, if you wrap them with a div, then you only have one thing that you return, only one value. It's a bit like returning 3 numbers by putting them into an array. Here we're returning 2 nested JSX elements by putting them into one div, which we return. Now, this also doesn't have to be a div. You could be using any element here. You could also be using a custom component here. The main thing that matters is that you only have one value which you return or which you store in a constant. And that's also what we're doing here. Now, there actually is also an alternative to that. Instead of using a div, we could use a native JavaScript array. I could remove my opening and closing div tags and put my card component here and that dynamic expression here into an array separated by commas. I just would need to remove these curly braces here because we're no longer inside of JSX here, we're inside of an array. That would be valid, but this has a little gotcha. We can return an array because React is able to work with arrays of JSX elements. We did utilize that when we output our list of users here, or also earlier in the course you learned about mapping arrays of data to JSX elements in the lists and conditionals module. So React knows how to work with arrays of JSX elements, and hence of course here we could also return such an array of JSX elements. If we do that, and we preview this application, we do get a warning though. Because whenever you're working with an array of JSX elements, React wants a key on every element. And that's no exception here. It wants that key if you map dynamically through a list of data and map that data to JSX elements. But it also wants such a key if you have a hard-coded array of JSX elements, as we have it here. Now, of course, we can simply add a key, and since this is not generated dynamically, we can hard code keys here, error modal, for example, and add user card. We could add the key prop with our own invented values, and we would be fine. And that would be perfectly fine. But typically, you don't use this solution because adding those keys, wrapping it in an array, is a little bit cumbersome. It's way easier to simply add a wrapping div here, like we had it before. So I can just go back to that, add my div here, and now wrap this here back into curly braces, and remove the comma here, because now we have a dynamic expression inside of JSX again, so we need the curly braces to evaluate this expression. So that's simply more convenient, and therefore typically we use the wrapping div. However, with the wrapping div, or generally any wrapping element, a new problem arises. Now we can end up with div soup. So we can end up with a real DOM that's being rendered where you have many nested React components, and all those components for various reasons need wrapping divs or other wrapping components. And you have all these unnecessary divs being rendered in the real DOM, even though they're only there because of this requirement or this limitation of JSX. And this is not an unrealistic scenario. In bigger applications, it's very possible that in your final HTML page, which is being served to your end users, you have a lot of unnecessary divs or other elements which are only there because you needed them as wrappers, even though they don't add any semantic or structural meaning to your page. Now, of course, you don't have to care about that. You might be fine with that, but it could break your styling. If you have a wrapping div somewhere and you use nested CSS selectors, that div could break stylings. And even if it doesn't break your styling, it's still not a good practice. You're rendering too many HTML elements, and ultimately that also makes your application slower because the browser needs to render all those elements and React needs to check all those elements, or at least some of those elements, if content needs to change. So rendering unnecessary content is generally never a good idea in programming. Hence, this wrapping div or this wrapping element approach is okay, but not ideal. So let me introduce the solution to you. What if we would use a dirty little trick? Here in my components folder, I'll add a new subfolder, helpers. I'll name it helpers because that best describes which kind of component I'm going to add. I'm going to add a wrapper component. I'll name the file React.js. And in there, I won't even import React because I'm not going to write any JSX code in there. Instead, I'll just create my wrapper component, get props, and have my function body, and export this wrapper. And now you might be wondering what I'm going to do here if I'm not writing any JSX code. Well, I'll just return props.children. Remember, the children prop holds all the content you're passing between the opening and closing tag of your custom component. Now, it is valid in a component to just return that content which you got between the opening and closing tags. And now I can import my wrapper. For example, here in add user, I can import wrapper from helpers wrapper, and I can use it as a regular React component. So I can go down there and replace my div, which has no other meaning than fulfilling this JSX requirement, with my wrapper. So I'm using my wrapper component here. And just to make this really clear again, this is basically an empty component. Everything it does is that it returns props children. But this is enough to fulfill this requirement JSX has. If I save this, my application still works just fine. And it works just fine because in add user, we have a wrapping element. Sure, it's an element which won't render anything to the DOM, but the requirement is not that there must be one root component being rendered to the DOM. The requirement just is that there must be one root element that you return or that you store in a constant or variable. And that's what we're doing here. We have one root element, the wrapper, and what we pass into that wrapper may be adjacent. That is okay, as I explained. Now, of course, all that content is taken and just returned here, but that's also okay because in this return statement, I technically still only returned one thing. I returned the value in props children. And this can be tough to wrap your head around, but this is just a technical requirement of JavaScript around which we're working here. I just work around that requirement by returning one thing here and one thing here. And of course, what we get here in props children will be that adjacent content, but that will not be a problem because I never directly return that in my code. And this will therefore work just fine. This will not cause any errors, as you can clearly tell. Now that's a nice little trick for solving this problem, because if we now have a look at the Elements tab, and therefore at the DOM, which is actually being rendered, we see that if I inspect my add form component, here's my form, we see there is a div around it, but that's just this card div. But what we also see is if I click add user, that this modal div is being added, but around that, we do have a wrapping div, but this is actually the div coming from the app component, where I also have the wrapping div. This is not coming from inside the add user component. Instead, from inside there, nothing is being rendered in the real DOM. We got the card, and above that, nothing. Because again, this div, which is above it, is coming from the app component. And that is, of course, pretty sweet. So with that custom wrapper component, we could use a little trick to fulfill this requirement and not end up with div soup. Now, because it's so convenient and also so obvious in the end, at least once you saw it, this wrapper component is actually not a component we need to build on our own. Instead, it comes with React. There, it's the fragment component, which you can access on react.fragment, or you just import fragment from React. I will show you how to use it in a second. Or in some projects, you can also use this shortcut on the right, but this depends on your project setup because your build workflow needs to support this. The left syntax will always work. And that's the same as our wrapper. These two syntaxes here render empty wrappers, which don't render any actual HTML element to the DOM. It's just built into React, but I showed you our custom wrapper so that you understand what these built-in wrappers do. So if we want to use the built-in wrappers, let's say in the app component, where I said that we also had the problem, we can remove the div and just use these empty tags. Now that's not valid HTML, and it's also not necessarily valid JSX in all projects. Your project setup needs to support it. Now this project setup does support it, and if you downloaded this attached project, which was attached earlier, you therefore shouldn't get any problems. And hence now if you save, you see it also still works. Everything works. And if I get that modal again, you see now that one div which we had before, don't mistake it for the root div, there was another div before, is now also gone because I'm now also using this wrapper, this fragment, as it's officially called, in the app component. Now, if this syntax doesn't work or if you don't like it, you can always use React.fragment like this, and this will then work. So React fragment opening and closing, this will always work. You just need to make sure you're importing React. Or you directly add fragment as a named import here in these curly braces from React. Then you can also use it just by that name. So that's an alternative. So that, of course, is what we'll typically use, fragment or React fragment or this shortcut. We're not typically writing our own wrappers, but of course it is important that you understand how it works under the hood, which is why I showed it to you. Fragments allow us to write cleaner code to end up with less unnecessary HTML elements on the final page, and that's great. React portals are another useful feature which do something similar, which also help us write cleaner code. Consider this made-up example here. We got two elements, two components, side by side, my modal and my input form, wrapped by a fragment, but the fragment won't matter here. We already learned about that. And the actual content that ends up in the real DOM might look something like this. We might have a section and a h2 tag coming from some other components, because the code on the left is just one of many components in our application, let's say. And then we have that brown content, which is actually the modal, which is being rendered to the DOM in the end by React, and the orange part is our form. Now, what's wrong with that? Technically, nothing. Technically, this is fine. But there is something in this code which is not ideal, and that would be that modal. This modal code, which is being rendered here in the DOM, will technically work as long as you applied the correct styling. It will look like a modal, as you also saw in that demo project we worked on. But semantically, and from a have a clean HTML structure perspective, this is not ideal. Why? Because you have to keep in mind that a modal basically is an overlay on your page. It is an overlay to the entire page. So logically, it's above everything else. And if it's then nested in some other HTML code, it might technically work because of styling, but it's not good code. It's not a good structure. And it can even lead to real problems, again, with styling or with accessibility if you have such nested overlay content, because if, for example, a screen reader has to interpret your HTML code which is being rendered, it might not see this as a general overlay, because your CSS styling won't matter too much there, and from a semantical perspective, from the structure it has, it's deeply structured in other HTML code. So it's not obvious that this modal should be an overlay to all the other content. And that's not just the case for modals. You would have similar problems for side drawers, for dialogues, so typically for all kinds of overlays or any related components. It's a little bit as if you would create a button by simply styling a div like a button and adding an event listener. It will work technically, but it's not a good practice. It's bad for accessibility, it's bad if a fellow developer has to work with that, it's simply not a good idea. In web development in general, with HTML and CSS and JavaScript, because it's so forgiving, You can make a lot of things work, but that doesn't mean that just because it works, it's also a good implementation. It's also a good idea to use it like this. And that's where we can use another React concept to get rid of this problem with this modal, with this overlay content, which shouldn't be deeply nested. We can use a portal to keep the structure we have on the left, so to keep writing our components the way we want to write them, so that we have no friction when we want to pass data around and so on, but to still render this differently in the real DOM, and to, for example, render the modal HTML content somewhere else than it would normally go to. So that on the left, the JSX code we write hasn't changed, but the rendered HTML code is a bit different from our JSX code. So the modal there is not next to the form. And you can achieve this with React portals. So let's see how portals work. Back in this project, we of course have an error modal. This is a nice little modal where I actually already see an opportunity to use a fragment. So let's quickly do that. But that's of course not the focus here. Instead here, we can now use a portal, because this entire modal actually shouldn't be rendered in the place where it is being rendered. Again, let me show you what I mean. If we inspect the real DOM that is being rendered, and I trigger that modal by submitting an invalid form, you see the modal divs for the backdrop and for the card, for the modal overlay, are being rendered here next to that card that holds my form, inside of the root div. Now in this application, because it's so tiny, that's actually not too bad. But of course, it's easy to imagine that you have an application where your add user component is not that close to the top of the whole application, but where it's deeply nested in some other components. And therefore, your backdrop and your modal divs would also be deeply nested in some other content in your DOM. And I actually would want to have them, let's say, here. I can drag and drop them here in the dev tools. I might want to have that structure, the backdrop div right below the body, so as a direct child of the body, and the same for the modal, a direct child of the body next to that root div, which holds the rest of our application. And this is something you can achieve with, well, portals. So now that I told you that portals are that great, how do we actually use them? Portals need two things. You need a place you want to port the component to, and then you need to let the component know that it should have a portal to that place. Now, to mark that place, we go into the public folder and there into the HTML file which is being rendered in the end. And here it's common that you add a div with an ID which you will then use to identify this place later. And here I could have my backdrop root and then also maybe my modal root. And you could create multiple such roots for different kinds of components that should be portaled there. Or you simplify this a bit and you have your backdrop root and simply your overlay root, which will then hold all kinds of overlays, modals, side drawers, and so on. And that's what I'll go with. So I added these two divs here, and then I save that file and go back to my components. Now let's work on the error modal, and let's tell React that this actually should be portaled somewhere. For that, to make this very easy, I will actually add a constant here, which I'll name backdrop, and this will be a new component, and I'll add it in this same file because in this app, I only use this backdrop component in conjunction with my modal. So I'll store all those components in one big file, but you could also split it into multiple component files, especially if you would use the backdrop in conjunction with other components as well. Here I'll only use it there though, so then I have my props, and now here I will return that div which gets my backdrop class. Now I'll also add my modal overlay component here, which gets props. And there I will return this card. And I'll actually cut this like this. So I basically split my modal into two separate components now, backdrop and modal overlay, because that will make working with portals much easier. We can also remove the backdrop div down there in the error modal now. So what do we now do here? In the end here, in that fragment, we can add an expression because we're still inside of JSX code here. And we now want to call a method which is actually not defined on React, but on another library that comes together with React, the React DOM library. You can imagine React being the library that has all the React features, state management, and so on baked in. And React DOM uses React to bring that logic and these features into the web browser. So to make them compatible to working with the DOM. Put in other words, the React library itself doesn't care whether you run it in an environment that has a DOM or if you would use it to build a native app. And for example, you can use React Native in conjunction with React to build native mobile apps. I do have a separate course on that though, so let's not worry about that here. So React DOM is kind of the adapter for React to the browser. And therefore, since now we're going to portal something into a different place in the real DOM, we need to import from React DOM. So import something from React-DOM. And that something here can just be React DOM. So you can give this any name you want, but since I named my React import React, I'll name this React DOM. And on React DOM, you can now call a createPortal method. Now the createPortal method takes two arguments. The first one is your React node that should be rendered. And here I can render my backdrop, let's say, like this. Important here, it wants JSX. So you don't pass just backdrop like this. Instead, you really render it like this. This is also very convenient because this allows me, of course, to forward my onClick prop here and get access to props on confirm, which I need to pass here to ensure that everything still works. So I can now set onClick here in my error modal and forward the function I get on the onConfirm prop to the onClick prop inside of that new backdrop component. Now, the second argument of createPortal is a pointer to that container in the real DOM where this element should be rendered in. And in my case, I of course want to render my backdrop here in that backdrop root component. So back in error modal, here we need to select this, and we don't just pass backdrop root or anything like that. Instead, we really select the element where it should be rendered to. And for this, we use a DOM API. We use document get element by ID, for example, and get access to the backdrop root. So we really get access to a real HTML DOM element, a DOM node here. And we do this with an API that is provided by the browser. Document get element by ID has nothing to do with React. We really get access to a real DOM element with this API. Normally, we don't use that in React because we let React do everything, but here we explicitly need to use this. By the way, just as we needed an element selected like this in Index.js. There, we also rendered the root component with the render method into a place selected with get element by ID. We're using the same logic now, but now we're not rendering an element there, but instead inside of an existing application, which is already being rendered by React, we move the HTML content that is about to be rendered into a different place. With that, let me reformat this and save it. And if we now go back and I click on add user, you see the backdrop appears. The modal does not, because I haven't added the logic for this yet, but the backdrop does. And in the Elements tab, we see that in the backdrop root, we now got the modal backdrop. And now it will always be there, no matter where you would use your error modal in your JSX code, no matter how deeply nested it is in other elements. It will always be here, which is of course very close to the body. We need this marker here though, but we could have also selected the body itself if we really wanted it as a direct child of body. But I think this is a bit easier to understand, which is why I use these extra hook divs, if you want to call them like this. Now let's repeat this for the actual overlay. For that, I'll add a new expression here, React.DOM, create portal. And here I want to render my modal overlay component. And my modal overlay component needs a bunch of props, which I now, of course, want to forward. It needs a title, it needs a content, and it needs onConfirm. So I'll just forward this. I'll forward the title, which I get on props title, the message, which I get on props message. I'll get my onConfirm was the last one, I think. Props onConfirm. Because actions, of course, is not a prop. So props onConfirm is the last one. Now I'm forwarding all of this. And now, of course, we also, just as with the backdrop, need to let React DOM know where it should render this HTML content that needs to be rendered. For that, I'll use document get element by ID and select my overlay root, which was that other div I created in the index.html file. And with that saved, if I reload and click add user, we see the modal, and interaction with the backdrop doesn't work, as I can tell. I will need to fix this, but with the modal it works, and we see everything is rendered in the divs where it should be rendered and no longer nested in our other HTML code. So let's quickly fix that backdrop. Yeah, I should of course forward this on onConfirm here, because I use onConfirm here inside of that backdrop. So I should set an onConfirm prop, but with that, it now works and I can close it by clicking on the backdrop again. So that's the portal. And the idea really just is that the rendered HTML content is moved somewhere else. In your JSX code, you now use that error modal just as you did before. Nothing changed there. In add user, I still have my error modal here. But it's now rendered. Its HTML code is now rendered in a different place. We use that error modal just as we used it before. And that's the cool thing about the portal. Nothing changes there. We can communicate with it as we did before. We can use it as if it would be rendered here. It just isn't. Also worth the note, React DOM create portal can be used anywhere where you would otherwise use JSX code. Of course, wrapped in curly braces because we're calling JavaScript code here, but we could have just rendered the backdrop here otherwise, right? That would have been our alternative. So wherever you would normally just use the component, you can use create portal to move that component's HTML content somewhere else. Only in the actual DOM that is being rendered. In JSX, in your components, you continue working with those components as you did before.